on talking about the issues around autism being too broad a term now. So yes, a good question is being raised that how can a single diagnostic label... Oh yeah, so I'm going to move on now to talking, this is carrying on kind of a discussion from the previous video, but on a different article. So this article is found in a conversation magazine, and hang on, yeah, I'm just making sure my notes are all over the place. Oh yeah, here it is, hang on. Yes, the conversation article, that's the one I wanted to talk about. The conversation article entitled From Deficits to Spectrum, Thinking Around Autism Has Changed. Now there are calls for profound autism diagnosis. So this was published in November 2022. So the term autism was first introduced into the diagnostic manual in 1980, which is actually really recent. Obviously, I guess like before 1980, because there wasn't an official diagnosis for autism until 1980. Before 1980, children... I would have to go back and reread the history because I can't quite remember, but I think before 1980, or the term autism wasn't there in the diagnostic manual, but it was instead, what was it called? Infantile psychosis. I think that's what it was described. So it's basically under the psychotic conditions. That's what it was considered to be, a form of schizophrenia, basically. So that's what it was. It was considered to be indistinguishable from schizophrenia, but like occurring in like childhood. But the term autism wasn't actually there until, obviously it was used. It was used in reference to schizophrenia. The term autism goes way back to like I think 1911 or something. But it was used in reference to schizophrenia. And Kanner, obviously in the 1940s, talked about autistic disorders of affective contact, but he basically almost saw it as kind of like a form of infantile psychosis, I think. But yeah, it wasn't until 1980 that you could actually get diagnosed officially as having autism when it first occurred in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But back then, autism connoted significant developmental difficulties, gross deficits in language development, and a pervasive lack of responsiveness to other people. Because the term Asperger's syndrome didn't enter the diagnostic manuals until 1994, and Asperger's syndrome had a really short shelf life in terms of it being a diagnosis, from about 1994 to 2013, I think. So, yeah, very short period of time where Asperger's was actually a diagnostic entity. Obviously, people still use the term, but it's no longer official. And, yeah, before 1994, Asperger's didn't exist as a diagnosis. So people who presented as highly verbal would very unlikely be diagnosed autistic. It's kind of impossible, really. Yeah, I think there was this understanding that some autistics did have language or did develop language, but and they would be kind of loosely or informally described as high functioning. But they would still have had to have exhibited, though, really quite pervasive lack of responsiveness to other people, like an extreme developmental disability, and by definition that would mean they would have really, really high support needs. So that was the face of autism back then. And Asperger's syndrome was slow to take off as a diagnosis unless you were quite kind of classically presenting, I guess. And it didn't become kind of very commonly used until the 2000s. It had a kind of brief moment in the sun, and then now it's now gone. But yeah, so I mean, if you think about it, autism as a diagnostic entity itself is very young, and the Asperger's form is even younger. So people with a diagnosis of autism in the 80s and 90s tended to have very high support needs, often went to special schools, not always, some of them went to mainstream, but they nearly always had very, very, very high support needs, were very obvious in their presentation. That all changed in the early 2000s. The early 2000s seems to have been a kind of turning point. Yes, it was the early 2000s. That's when you start to see more and more people being diagnosed with Asperger's as a kind of teachers and other people would become more aware of the term. As back in the 90s, very few people were familiar with Asperger's. Their knowledge of autism would be those without much language, so no wonder I didn't get diagnosed. Obviously, like a lot of people later diagnosed autistic were simply described as having special educational needs, like I was, but kind of not actually given a diagnosis. Often these people would present as an enigma, like I was, because teachers or other people, I guess their understanding of autism was those who couldn't talk or had minimal language, and if they had a child who presented highly verbal but who still had these other challenges, I don't think autism wouldn't be the first thing to come to mind, because they would be thinking, well, the child can talk. But obviously the child still had all these other challenges, hence they'd often get described as being an enigma, like I was, diagnosed with special educational needs. Horrible term if you ask me, but that's the language that's used. I don't know if it's still used these days. Very stigmatising. Kind of almost like dustbin children. No one knew what to do with them. So as I say, 2000s and 2010s, that's when you saw a reconceptualisation of autism, a complete overhaul in the way autism was understood, and now you started to see increasingly those with high verbal abilities getting diagnosed. I was too old for that. I mean, I was born to, I missed that. I was born too old. So I didn't get my diagnosis till I was 21. But if I was born, say, I don't know, even if I was born 7 years later, there's a very good chance I would have got diagnosed at least as a teenager, because that's when a change was occurring. My dad first heard the term back in 2000, 2001, and he thought I might have it. Obviously I was in denial, not much, but that's when he first heard about Asperger's. At teacher training, 2000, I think it's 2000, 2001, that was when the shift occurred, basically. Basically, if I was growing up now, I certainly would have got diagnosed, there's no doubt about that, because all the signs were there. But 2000s and 2010s, that's when we saw a reconceptualisation of autism. Autistic behaviours became understood as present in people who do not have language impairments or who do not have very profound intellectual disabilities. And autism spectrum was born. The wider autism spectrum, this idea that autism can take shape in many different forms, that was very much a product of the early 2000s. Also, the media portrayals accelerated this shift in community views, so TV shows tended to focus on stereotypes of intellectually gifted men, and it was nearly always men with social difficulties. So it's almost like, going to the other extreme now. No middle ground. It's like you go from one extreme, severe, profound developmental disability, right the way through to the other extreme of just socially awkward, a bit quirky, with extreme intellectual gifts, which kind of is a mistake, really. What they should have done is focus more on the middle ground, because that's where you find most autistic people, not at either extreme, but instead they go from one extreme to the other. And of course, I would argue that often these intellectually gifted men with social difficulties, a lot of them, I would say, aren't even clinically significantly impaired, so there's an argument there as to whether or not they really are autistic anyway, or whether or not they're actually just broad autism phenotype. But that's the stereotype, isn't it? Slightly quirky, nerdy man. And this whole extreme male brain crap coming out from Simon Cohen's idea that all men are a bit autistic, and that nonsense doesn't exactly help matters. Where was I? Hang on. Oh yeah, here it is. So the question is, how can a single diagnostic label that incorporates TV's Dr. Sheldon Cooper, as well as people who require 24/7 care, how can it actually serve all autistic people? Because a diagnosis, for it to be valid, has to kind of point to a recognisable condition. It has to identify a condition. It has to kind of use a diagnosis to inform support. But if that diagnosis is so broad that it means so many different things, then that can become quite confusing. I think it was good. I think it was helpful. I think it was a very important step in progress for autism to move forward to include highly verbal people with significant social difficulties. I think that was a good thing, and I think we mustn't completely bash the neurodiversity movement. They did do some important early work in give them credit where credit is due. They did, after all, pave the way for people like me to be diagnosed. So, I mustn't completely bash those who have benefited me. But, and in actual fact, if it had stopped there, if that's what they had done, I wouldn't have any problems with the neurodiversity movement. It's the fact that it's become this it's completely changed, I think, with the birth of social media. I think the early days of the neurodiversity movement weren't too bad. They were mainly involved in kind of like advocacy, making it aware that autism could come in different forms. But it's kind of completely changed now into this kind of positive stereotyping, kind of almost supremacist movement. It's kind of been overtaken. Sadly, this often happens with movements. They start out well-intentioned, and then they kind of become deformed over time. And now it seems to have become very much an elite kind of social club, which just goes on about autism being this great kind of difference and kind of all society, and like saying, there's nothing wrong with autistics, and like there's no it's no disorder, it doesn't need treatment and all of that. That's where it's gone wrong, if you ask me, because some people can say that for themselves, but fair enough, but it's the way they're kind of like applying this to all autistics, and also, which is really damaging, and also the whole rise of a self-diagnosis culture, and it's kind of getting rid of like autism as a medical condition is deeply damaging. So I just feel it's completely it's become deformed over time, unfortunately. So it did do some important early work. That was important because there are loads of people out there who are extremely disabled and historically wouldn't have got proper help, and what would have happened is a lot of them would have ended up homeless if they didn't have people helping them. In actual fact, it is true that a large percentage of the homeless population is actually autistic, but if you're autistic and you don't have support networks, you don't have family, I'm lucky, I've got family to help me, but if you're autistic and you don't have family to help you, you can easily end up homeless. So if you're in that middle zone, you're not someone with this extreme language disability where your needs are obvious, but you're in that middle zone, of being very disabled, but unfortunately without any family to help you or whatever, it's very easy for autistic people to end up homeless. Or in trouble for various reasons. So expanding the diagnosis to include people like that is great, but like I say, and that needed to happen. I guess it's a bit like with other diagnoses like schizophrenia, they have broadened a bit over time to include